Welcome. It is Mitch. I am on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. Packers getting ready to head to Chicago to take on the Bears Sunday at Soldier Field. One thing we can do as observers and as fans that, the team isn't doing and, the coaching staff sure as hell isn't preaching it is look ahead. We can take a little peek past the regular season and see how things are stacking up. Not in the NFL particularly, but more zoned in for the Packers' sake in the NFC. How are things taking form? How is the playoff picture molding together as November gets set to turn to December and December to January, so on and so forth? I'll put the NFC standings up on the screen right now. As you can see, of course, top 7 seeds make it. 1 seed gets a bye. It's 2 versus 7, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5. Playoffs started today. Green Bay would be at Philadelphia, a Week 1 rematch of what we saw in Brazil. Now, the Lions sit atop the throne right now in the NFC at 8-1, and I think that's very fitting. Sometimes you can, throughout a season, I would say more earlier on, teams can get off to a quick start that maybe you didn't expect, and things can start to take shape as the season carries on. I will firmly stand on the mountaintop right now and say that Detroit, to me, is not only the best team in the NFC, but perhaps the NFL. Now, that can change, and one bad playoff game can derail the dreams, the hopes and dreams for the Detroit Lions. I think they're the best team in the NFC, and I think if you split the conference up into tiers, Detroit does stand alone right now. I don't put Philadelphia on the same tier as the Lions right now. The Falcons, the Cardinals, the Vikings, the Commanders, or the Packers, or even the 49ers, and then there's kind of a drop-off, at least in my opinion, right now. I think the Lions are on their own tier. That can change. A lot will change, and they're certainly not unbeatable. They lost to Tampa Bay back in Week 2. They escaped against Houston last Sunday night. They escaped a game in Minnesota a few weeks ago. Beat up on the Packers, I think, pretty good, though, right? 24-14, I mentioned a couple weeks ago after that game took place. Didn't feel like a 24-14 game. Felt more like a 31-10, 34-10 kind of drubbing that Detroit gave the Packers. But we saw last year, Detroit beats Green Bay in Green Bay on a Thursday night. Green Bay responds a few weeks later on a Thursday in Detroit and beats the crap out of the Lions. So Detroit's not unbeatable. I just think right now they are the clear cream of the crop in the NFC. And my major takeaway from their win in Houston last Sunday night might differ from yours, because I did see that Detroit escaped, and it took a game-winning field goal as time expired for them to beat a pretty good Texans team that is dealing with some injuries, primarily at wide receiver. Stephon Diggs out for the year. Nico Collins trying to come back. Sounded like he might be back for that game against Detroit, and then ultimately was ruled inactive shortly before kickoff in that game last Sunday night. But a lot of people looked at that game for the Lions and said, ooh, Jared Goff threw not 1, 2, 3, 4, he threw 5 picks. Jared Goff threw 5 interceptions. The offense didn't look that good for Detroit. The defense looked suspect in the first half against Houston before buckling down, and I think a lot of people looked at that game and their takeaway was Detroit's vulnerable. They can be beaten. Of course they can. Any team can. I mean, Kansas City should have lost to Denver. They're the only team that still has a goose egg in the loss column. My takeaway from that Lions win against Houston was not, ooh, they're vulnerable and they can be beaten. Like, they didn't look that good. That all was already, to me at least, and everyone else, previous knowledge. Everyone's beatable any given Sunday, all that crap. My takeaway was this Detroit team went on the road, played, I would say, C- football for their standard, and they beat a division leader who I think Houston, that's a pretty formidable team. I thought maybe they'd be better at this point in the season compared to what they are or what the reality appears to be at this moment, and maybe they fine-tune some things and figure it out. But my takeaway was Detroit just played C- brand of football and won on the road in the NFL in a standalone game against a division leader. Wow. Detroit's really freaking good. That was my takeaway. If yours differs, that's fine. We all have opinions. But I did not look at that game and come away thinking, hey, Detroit looked awfully beatable in that game against Houston. No, mine was they just played below average football and still beat a division leader on the road with their quarterback throwing 5 interceptions. So to me, they're the top of the class right now, but certainly beatable. And after that, it's like, if I'm viewing this, I'll put the standings back up for you. If I'm viewing this through the Packers prism, and I think I've mentioned this on a couple of other videos in recent weeks, and it still holds true, at least in my opinion, and maybe I just have the goggles on, because I know Green Bay still has a lot to clean up, pre-snap penalties in general, the interceptions, the drop passes. It's miserable getting a pass rush, any sort of pass rush, begging for it since the Tennessee game earlier in the season. But if I look across the NFC, is there any team that really, really worries you if you're the Packers? Like, is there any team right now, either in the picture or in the hunt, that outside of Detroit, that you would look at and say, man, I just don't like how that stacks up for Green Bay? They lost week 1 to Philadelphia in Brazil. I think the Packers are a better team now than they were week 1, although some of the same problems still exist. Philadelphia is a good team, but there's still something weird going on with Sirianni, and are the players truly bought in? I mean, 7-2 would tell you certainly his message isn't falling on deaf ears. I don't look at Philly as a team that, if Green Bay had to go into Philadelphia wildcard weekend, that I'd be like, oh man, Green Bay doesn't really have a shot in this one. And I say the same thing if they had to go into Atlanta right now or Arizona. I just think, again, outside of Detroit, and I'm not crowning Detroit as the NFC representative, it's wide open. And one team, if you're a Packers fan, that you have to constantly keep tabs on is San Francisco. If the playoffs started today, San Francisco would be on the outside looking in, sitting at 5-4. It'd be Arizona who would be representing the NFC West as the division winner. And I know the easiest thing in the world is to suggest that San Francisco is going to figure it out. McCaffrey's back. Obviously, they know Ayuk's out for the year, so they don't have to juggle with a timeline for him. But they get CMC back. Debo's back in the picture after he was out for a couple of games. The one caveat that I would throw into the mix that I think still favors Arizona is the remaining schedule. San Francisco, first place last year. They get a first place schedule this year as it pertains to, the other opponents you have on your schedule. You get your division teams twice. Everyone in the NFC West is matched up with a division in the AFC and matched up with a division in the NFC. And then it's those extra games. The division you aren't playing in the NFC, you get the first place finisher from last year and the other two, and then you're matched up with an AFC division winner from a year ago as well. And I look at San Francisco's remaining schedule, and keep in mind they're 5-4. They still have games at Green Bay, at Buffalo, at Miami, who you can scoff at, but Miami with Tua is obviously a much, much different team than when they don't have Tua. And so they play at Green Bay still, at Buffalo, at Miami, and they finish the year at Arizona, who has been a pleasant surprise this year. Those aren't easy. They also host Los Angeles, the Rams, Detroit on Monday Night Football the day before New Year's Eve, and this upcoming weekend, they host Seattle. That is not an easy schedule. At Green Bay, at Buffalo, those aren't gimmies. At Miami, not a gimme. Hosting Detroit, hosting the Rams, not gimmies. Seattle this weekend, I would expect the 49ers to win, but who knows? And then I look at Arizona's schedule. They still get New England at home, at Carolina, the Seahawks twice, who I just mentioned for San Francisco. I expect San Francisco to beat Seattle this weekend, but who knows? But Arizona gets New England at home, Carolina, Seattle twice. They get the Vikings on the road, who, I don't know. The Vikings, we'll get to them in a minute. And then they finish up, as I mentioned, at home against the 49ers. They already beat the 49ers in San Francisco. If I'm a Packers fan and you want a rooting vested interest in the NFC playoff picture outside of the Packers, I would say two things. The division seems like maybe a long shot at this point, but you're still rooting for Detroit to lose. You want to win your division, so you're assured at least one home playoff game. And then root for San Francisco to stay out of the picture. I don't know how realistic it is, even though their schedule is a whole lot more beefed up than what Arizona has. But San Francisco has proven time and again in the postseason they are Green Bay's kryptonite. We saw it last year in a game that Green Bay should have won. We've seen it in Lambeau Field with Colin Kaepernick, almost a decade ago, without Colin Kaepernick in the snow game. What was that, 5 years ago? I can't even remember now. A few years ago, and the blocked punt in the fourth quarter when Green Bay led 10-3, and then San Francisco walked it off with a Robbie Gould field goal. If San Francisco can be kept out of the picture for Green Bay, it's all the more merrier. And if you're saying we're focused on Green Bay right now, we don't want to cherry pick around, I'm 100% keeping tabs on all these other teams. Because while I respect Arizona, and I think it's a great story, I don't think there's anyone in the league that you could ask right now that if they had their choice, hey, would you rather travel to San Francisco on Wild Card Weekend or Arizona? I don't think anyone's signing up and saying, you know what, we'll take on that 49ers team as things currently sit, right? I don't think anyone's saying, yeah, we'll take on San Francisco. We'd rather face them than Arizona. And so that's why I look at the NFC, and it is, outside of Detroit, it's a crapshoot. You could still see some juggling in the NFC East. Washington and Philadelphia playing on Thursday night. Minnesota, I mentioned them. I follow a couple of Vikings, not strictly Vikings content creation pages, but Minnesota sports content creation pages. I lived in Minneapolis for a few years, and I just like the work that some of the guys do creating content, whether it's for the Timberwolves, Twins, Vikings up there. And there's one podcast I follow, and when Sam Darnold was on this heater to start the year, their talks were quite literally circulating around Sam Darnold. What do we do after this year? If Sam Darnold stays on this heater, we drafted J.J. McCarthy in the first round, but how do you get rid of Darnold? He's playing at an MVP level. It went from that to, I tuned into one of their episodes this past week after he had a pretty abysmal performance in Jacksonville, albeit a win. Was it 12-7 or something? They beat the Jags, and they were ranking quarterbacks, and they had Darnold currently ranked 20th out of the 32 NFL starting quarterbacks. I have said this from the jump, from the rip of the regular season. I think the Sam Darnold story is awesome. I think it's a story that proves that environment and situation and coaching matters a whole hell of a lot. He was drafted by the Jets, a place where quarterbacks typically go to have their careers go up in flames or start, like in his case, where you're drafted there, and they immediately get torched. And then he went to Carolina, where there was chaos and there was no stable force, stable environment set in place for a quarterback to succeed. You know, they tried Darnold, they tried Baker Mayfield. Hopefully it works out for Bryce Young, but who knows? And then he ends up in Minnesota, where he's looking around. He's like, I got a decent offensive line. Kevin O'Connell's a great head coach. I know Packer fans might not want to hear that. Kevin O'Connell's a great head coach. And you got Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, Aaron Jones comes over, Hawkinson's back. That's a really good setup for a quarterback. And Darnold balled out early. Now he's come back down to earth. Now he hasn't come back down to earth to the Darnold we saw in Carolina or New York, but he's really kind of plateaued into looking very, very average the last few weeks. I bring that up to say this. If you're a Packers fan, and I know the Vikings beat Green Bay earlier this year, and they'll play again as that New Year's weekend in Minneapolis, just like last year, I'm not too concerned with the Vikings come playoff time. I do not think a team, as good as the roster could be constructed, as good as the coaching could be, I do not think a team with Sam Darnold as the starting quarterback can win a Super Bowl. I just don't. I think I've brought this example up before. The Nick Foles Philadelphia thing was a flash in the pan, an outlier situation that you don't typically see. And so that's why even as the Vikings sit here at 7-2, but they have not looked good. They didn't look that great against Indianapolis, but they won. They didn't look that great against Jacksonville, but they won. I'm not worried about Minnesota if I'm Green Bay. Like if I'm stacking up, and again, I'm not saying the Packers players, coaches, because they're doing the 1 week at a time thing as they should. I'm saying I'm not worried if you're a Packers fan about like if you face the Vikings somehow in the playoffs, or that New Year's Eve matchup could be some get back for the Packers for losing at home earlier this year to a Vikings team that was rocking and rolling when they entered Lambeau Field compared to kind of how they are now, again, even though they're still stacking up wins. So the NFC to me is just, it's fascinating. If you look at quarterbacks, right now the quarterbacks that would be starting in the postseason in the NFC are Jared Goff, who's playing pretty good football, sans the Houston game. Jalen Hurts has been to a Super Bowl before, but then it's, Kirk Cousins. I like Kirk, but he's never gotten it done in the playoffs. It's Kyler Murray. I think he's been in one playoff game before he's 0-1. It's Sam Darnold, has never started a playoff game. It's Jaden Daniels, an electric rookie. They bought at the deadline and doubled down and traded for Marshawn Lattimore. But if you're the Packers and you have to go to Washington, or somehow you're hosting Washington in the playoffs, it's not a team that you're looking at. And you're like, wow, I don't like our Green Bay's chances. San Francisco's the team right now, outside looking in, even though they're 5-4 that. That is the boogeyman. That's the boogeyman for Green Bay. And so it's wide open. Detroit's top tier right now. That can certainly change. Yes, they looked vulnerable against Houston, but the fact that they won that game worried me even more because they played C- football, like I said, and still took out the Texans. So we'll see. I just thought past the halfway point. By the way, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Appreciate all the support. Past the halfway point of the season, Packers coming off a bye. I like how things set up the next couple weeks. The Bears look dreadful. They look beaten down. You hope to win this Sunday in Chicago. And then you come back home for 2, and it's a tough 2, but they're both at home, San Francisco and Miami. And you have a chance to really hone in on the home games if you're Green Bay, because you've already lost to Detroit at home, and you've already lost to Minnesota at home. Your other loss, of course, is the neutral field game against Philly. And those ones, I mean, if you think it left a sour taste in your mouth as a Packers fan, them losing 2 division games at home, imagine how the team feels, right? Beat Chicago, come back home. Maybe I'm trying to take one big bite of the apple, but if they split against San Francisco and then Miami on Thanksgiving night, I wouldn't even be satisfied with that. Take both of them. Get to 9-3. And then after that, you sort it out. What is it? Seahawks, Saints, or Seahawks, or it's Lions after the Dolphins, and then Seahawks, Saints, Vikings, Bears, something like that to finish up the season. But Green Bay's right in the thick of it. I know you can view it right now as, oh my gosh, Green Bay's just hanging on to the last playoff spot. Barring major injuries, I would be stunned if the Packers aren't a playoff team this year. Like right now, they have the 7th spot in a tournament where 7 teams make it from each conference. But again, I'm looking around the landscape of the rest of that. I would be, again, barring major injuries, I would be shocked if Green Bay was not a playoff team. Division might be a stretch at this point. You need Detroit to start slipping up. You certainly have to beat them in Detroit later this year to have a shot at the division crown and host at least one home playoff game. But the NFC's starting to take picture a little bit. I'm looking at teams that, like, I want to finish with this too because I think we can kind of condense how things look in the NFC. Giants aren't going to the playoffs. Panthers aren't going to the playoffs. Saints aren't going to the playoffs. Cowboys are 3-6. Dak's out for the year. They're not going to the playoffs. The Bears are 4-5, but I see no path. They play the Lions twice, the Packers twice, the Vikings twice. I don't see it. That's 6 of their 8 remaining games. Lions twice, Vikings twice, Packers twice. Good luck, Chicago. They're 4-5. I don't see it. Rams, Seahawks are both 4-5. I think Rams are better suited to try to figure it out, even though that offensive line's kind of a mess right now. Tampa Bay at 4-6. They're slipping. You don't have Evans. You don't have Godwin. Baker's having a more than admirable season. I think Baker Mayfield's been pretty good. The thing that goes in Tampa Bay's favor and why I won't rule them out is their schedule as well. The Bucs are 4-6. They're 2 out of the division lead of Atlanta. But the next 3 weeks for Tampa Bay, they get the Giants, the Panthers, and the Raiders. And then they finish up. You know, there's games lumped in there. Chargers, Cowboys, and the Cowboys, of course, don't have Dak. But the next 3 weeks, Tampa gets Giants, Panthers, Raiders, 3 very winnable games. And then their last 2 games are both at home against the Panthers and Saints, who are both 3-7. So while Tampa's 4-6, and it's not looking pretty right now, again, you have to look at the schedules for the teams. That's why when I said Arizona leads San Francisco by a half game right now, they've already beaten San Francisco head-to-head, and they have a lot easier schedule than the 49ers do. That all matters. It's easy to look at it and say, 49ers will figure it out. They're a better team than Arizona. They'll win the NFC West. That might come to fruition. But San Francisco, I mean, trips to Green Bay, Buffalo, Miami, you still play the Lions at home, you still play the Rams, and then you finish up at Arizona. That is not easy compared to what I mentioned earlier that the Cardinals have. So we'll see how it shakes out. Just threw a lot your way. I think to summarize here, we can basically, I feel really good about the Packers making the playoffs. Winning the NFC North, tough sledding right now, especially you're 0-2 in the division and they're both home losses. Like you have 4 left, but 3 of them are on the road at Chicago, at Detroit, at Minnesota, and then you host the Bears in the regular season finale. So we'll see how it breaks down. It starts this weekend, though. You got to beat the Bears. You can't lose to a Chicago team that sits down, and you can't start 0-3 in the division. But I feel good about, even though they're in the 7th spot, I feel good about where Green Bay's at coming out of the bye. Just kind of projecting out how the NFC could shake out. So we'll see. There's some big games this weekend, and Washington Philly is certainly one to keep tabs on too. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Appreciate all the support as always. We'll see you next time.